Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video, we're going to look at one of my few large orchid in my collection, and this one is Phalaenopsis sesame. I think it has the name sesame for a very good reason, and that is the spots that you can see on its flowers. I was going through a phase where I was very attracted to orchids with spotty flowers or spotty leaves, and so this was one of the big ones that I got. Anyway, let's go back in time, right? So beginning of February 2019, that was when I discovered that this orchid was putting out a spike. Even though its existing two spikes were still green, but nothing was happening. But I didn't really notice it until that it had already had like an inch and a half, because where I placed this location, this orchid, is at a location that's on the very top corner shelf in my grow space, because it takes up so much space that I didn't want to put it on my my orchid rack. So this one is located at a corner shelf adjacent from the window. It's at a corner on the very top of the shelf. So I normally don't get to take it down. I don't take it down. I don't have a good reason to, unless I have to give this orchid water, which I will talk a little bit about how I give this orchid water and how often later in the video. But based on what I'm telling you, you can probably already infer that I don't give this orchid a lot of water, or not, at least not very frequent. But anyway, so around mid-April 2019 was when it first opened its first bloom. And so the waiting period from when I discover new flower spike emerging till I get my first bloom, it was about 2 months. So it was a bit of a wait, but I think it's well worth it, because this orchid, it's one of those large size phal. It's not mid-size, definitely not small size, it's large. And later in the video, I will have a video portion to show you just how big the leaf span is. But for now, let's just enjoy some of the orchid photos. And here is the video portion. So the flowers were looking really good, very energetic, and I also did the right thing by training this spike to go up, because this orchid is a large Phalaenopsis orchid. So if I didn't train the orchid spike to go up, it would just have that cascade, and it actually would go really long. And if that's the case, then this orchid cannot even be put on a regular counter space to be enjoyed. It will have to be put at the very high, so it will have to go back up to where it is usually placed, which is at the very top level of my shelf. And that is in my grow space, but that's not my living room or my dining table. So I'm glad that I did that. For my mid-size and small-size Phalaenopsis orchid, this year at least, I did not put any stick for any of them, because I really enjoy the natural cascade looking of the flowers and flower spike. One thing I want to do differently with this orchid is probably increase the fertilizer regimen, because this orchid, its newest leaf is not as big or bigger than two of its previous leaves. And even though this orchid is large and its previous leaves are humongous with big leaf span, I think that it's not reaching its full potential. So I suspect that it just needed more water and fertilizer. And I usually only give this orchid quarter strength fertilizer, just like most of my orchids. and this one may, I suspect, need a little bit more than just a quarter strength fertilizer. In terms of watering, I always soak this orchid because I know, because its media is still bark chips. I haven't repotted this orchid because when it was done blooming, its flower spikes were still green, and at the time I didn't think that the bark chips were, going bad, so I wanted to wait. And I think this year I may still not repot it. I would just try to increase the fertilizer strength or concentration to see if its newer leaves would get bigger, and if not, next year I can up the fertilizer concentration or strength and repot it just to see how it does. And also in the bag you may see that I have a clay saucer at the end. That's what I use to kind of make sure that there is enough air, because I think there is not enough space between the outer pot, the outer container, and the actual container that the orchid is in. So I wanted to make sure that there is enough and additional gaps to allow moisture to get out, and also allow a little bit of gas exchange, a little bit of circulation. Anyway, so fast forward, end of May 20th, 2019, that's when this orchid became in full bloom, and everything was really looking good. And this orchid basically was I think it was in bloom for quite some time. I can't remember exactly for how long, but I think it was it was in bloom well into mid-July. So by now you probably noticed the last flower that it bloomed, right? It was kind of interesting. Instead of the regular triangle shape of petals and the two petals, its top right and top left of the last flower actually has a little bit of a flare going on. So it makes me smile, because I feel like that particular flower has two hands waving at me. Anyway, so end of June 2019, finally the existing two flower spikes finally became dried or yellow, so I decided to cut them at the base. And so now, after that, I only really had this one new flower spike, but with lots of interesting bloom. And one of the nodes started to grow something, but I wasn't sure if anything will come out of that. So I'll keep you guys posted if that particular joint actually has any development at all. Maybe it's another secondary spike that will come out. We don't know, but if it does come out with something, I'll definitely make a video to update you. So earlier I talked about how I water this orchid. I always soak this orchid. I don't only just give it certain amount of water, I always make sure it's soaked with at least 80, 85%, even 90% of the up to 80 or 90% of the media, because this orchid is so big and I can't really tell whether it only needs quarter cup or half a cup, so I need to soak it really well. And because it's in bark chips, mostly barks, maybe a little bit of sphagnum moss, but mostly bark, and with lots of good root system. So I just want to soak it well, so that way I don't have to worry about it. And usually, I would say 10 days I will give this orchid some water, but oftentimes, because it's on the very top shelf, at very top of a shelf, so I normally tend to forget. And I think at most I have waited for 3 weeks to give this orchid water, and it is still doing just fine. So I think bigger orchids may be able to tolerate a slightly longer dry or drought period, because they have bigger leaves, and usually their leaves are slightly more substantial than smaller orchids, so they could probably wait a little longer if you don't get to give them water right away, or at the right scheduled time. For example, most of my orchids in my collection receive water in summertime every 7 days. In wintertime is every 14 days or so. But this orchid, summertime, I think that last year it was every 2 weeks. And sometimes wintertime, you know, like I said, sometimes I forget, and before I know it, 3 weeks have gone by and this orchid would then get some water. But anyway, overall, I'm pretty pleased with this orchid's bloom cycle this year. And I'm especially impressed with the last bud and flower that this orchid gave me, because it really looks like it has two little hands waving at me. So, and also this orchid totally satisfied with my obsession with orchids with spots, whether it's spotted flower or spotted leaves. This orchid really just does a lot of things for me. The only thing I would say though is this orchid is really a little too large for my liking. That's why it's really always at the top. If it were a mid-size or small size, I think I would love it even more. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!